This is Cruis'n USA, a cross-country road trip filled with high-speed collisions, illegal street racing, and this shirtless guy at the finish line. Folks, you can already tell this is a classy game, and it bears the unique distinction of being the first automobile racing game on the N64, though not the first racing game in general, and it's the 7th overall game in North America for the console. But in the aggregate, this is not a very well-liked game. It received harsh reviews on release, and the reputation hasn't changed in the ensuing years. So in this video, we'll hopefully get to the bottom of why that is. It's not an unpleasant game necessarily, but it does mark a questionable early release for a new console. Welcome to Computer Lab Hijinks, a show about games, old software, and web ephemera, and we are on a quest to review every N64 game in release order, with some exceptions, mostly sports games and things like that. And here we arrive at Cruis'n USA. This is a game about street racing. It's a game about crashing into stuff, because crashing into things is fun. Cars start piling up, and then more cars start piling up, and it gets even more chaotic by the second. This was supposedly meant to release alongside the N64, but was delayed at least twice. According to IGN, Nintendo had told news outlets that the game was delayed due to its poor performance, with extra time needed in development just to pass QA testing. I have no reason to doubt this narrative because the game as released doesn't run well or look particularly good. Alternatively, there's a rumor going around that these delays were caused by Nintendo's requests for content changes, although I couldn't find any primary sources on this, so take that with a grain of salt. Either way, it is by no means a graphical showcase. It's perhaps the first N64 game to boldly ask, what if we push the console to its absolute limits with a straightforward port of an arcade game from 2 years ago? As you can see, most things are flat textures except for vehicles and some terrain, and it looks pretty early 90s. Regardless, it is the 6th best-selling game of holiday 96, and that's largely because there wasn't that much software for the N64 when it first came out, but either way, this game sold quite well and is kind of forgotten now. And so in that spirit, I want to revisit this game, look at the contemporary reception from critics at release, and talk about my own thoughts on this game, the unfortunate graphics and music, which are quite interesting unto themselves, and some of the unique systems in this game that were ambitious but poorly implemented. There is a large question looming over this whole discussion, which is, why would Nintendo put their name on a game that was so unpolished? This isn't just any old N64 game, it is published by Nintendo. They presumably funded and helped facilitate the porting of this particular game. And at the time, I'm not saying this is the case anymore, but at the time, Nintendo had fairly rigorous QA standards to get their approval to ship a title, and this game was supposedly delayed for that exact reason. So, how did this happen? Who let this happen? And why does this almost launch title look so decidedly out of date? As you can see, there is a very short draw distance, which means oncoming cars kind of just appear. It's a game that relies on very subtle turns, largely to duck out of the way of things that are coming at you at high speeds, and it's clearly designed for the arcade racing wheel. And to that end, it is some of the smoothest, most responsive controls I've seen in a racing game. There are many negative things to say about this game, but it controls pretty well. One of the most common complaints about this game is its flat levels, which is absolutely correct. Here's some sped up footage so you can see just how horizontal the whole thing is. It's certainly a misguided release for a new console launch, as it's functionally more aligned with pole position or Sonic Drift than it is with 3D racers like Ridge Racer or Daytona USA. This is last-gen game design released at the absolute worst time. And so before we dive any deeper into this game, I'm gonna derail a little bit to complain about the title. Cruis'n USA is kind of two lies in a row. Cruising implies a chill drive with no destination. Let's cruise down to Webster, New York and see what happens. Whereas this is racing, which very much has a goal, a predetermined path. If you're cruising in a street race, you will almost definitely lose. And if I may bust out the OED, because that's just where we are on this channel, Here is one of the definitions. Cruise, to sail to and fro over some part of the sea without making for a particular port or landing place. So that's obviously in reference to ships, but toward the end here, in modern times, for pleasure. It is a relaxing journey across some distance, which to me feels misaligned with the whole racing theme. Also, USA, the second part of the title. It implies this cross-country road trip, if you will, where you'll see all the landmarks of Americana. And some of those are here. There's the Hollywood sign, the White House, Mount Rushmore. However, here's the thing that really bothers me about the USA part of this title. There are 14 levels, half of them are in California. Folks, for most of my playthrough, I kept wondering, are we ever going to leave this one state? Will the game continue with this density of content all the way across America? If so, there must be 100 levels. Now, of course, there aren't. There's a fairly normal amount of levels, but half of it is California. I thought that was quite bizarre, and if I may, having critiqued this title to this degree, I must point out that Midway later released a game for the N64 called California Speed. That is what this game should have been called. There's speed, you're in California, perfect title. Anyway, this game is called Cruis'n USA, a very misleading title in my opinion, and I will be sure to let the developers know my concerns. I'll send them an email. Anyway, a big part of this video is I want to talk about the reviews on release, because they are largely negative and often scathing. So we're going to start with Computer and Video Games Magazine, based in the UK, who wrote the following. For some reason, American gamers can't get enough of Cruis'n USA's unique combination of terrible jerky graphics, appalling car handling, boring straight tracks, repetitive action, and atrocious honky-tonk rock soundtrack that could be done on the cheapest Casio keyboard available. And I love that joke. As someone who owns a Casio keyboard, there is quite a style to that music. But Cruis'n USA isn't all bad. It has the rare ability to reduce people to tears of laughter within minutes. And yeah, the aesthetics of this game on first glance are quite jarring, perhaps even comedic. So the author was not holding back. Cruis'n actually released a few months later in PAL regions, so the critics are often responding to the sales numbers, which, as we mentioned before, are quite strong. They're looking at one of the best-selling N64 games and rightly asking, why? This game's not that good, so why is this game selling so well? So that's one of the harsher reviews, and so we'll look at Pierre Schneider's IGN review, which is similarly quite harsh. Let's face it, the arcade game wasn't all that hot to begin with, but the final N64 version turned out to be even more disappointing. Ignoring the dated gameplay and less than impressive physics and handling, at least graphical problems like pop-up and low frame rate should have been fixed. Rent it for a few hours of fun, but don't waste your money on it. And so that is the IGN review, again, similarly negative. And so, as is custom on this channel, we're going to look at the official Nintendo Power review. And I love revisiting these reviews because they're a fairly unique cross-section of pseudo-journalistic writing. It is, of course, a product catalog by Nintendo in the form of a news magazine. And that's not a criticism necessarily, it's just understanding what we're reading. So with that in mind, let's take a look at their Cruis'n USA review and unpack some of the choices, because I think there's some very interesting writing here. Quote, for reasons that defy technical analysis but are clear to anyone who just likes to rip, Cruis'n USA ranks as one of the most popular arcade games of the 90s. And folks, this, dare I say, is clever writing. The author essentially found a way to say Cruis'n USA looks bad, performs poorly, is outdated, and doesn't do anything new. They found a way to say all that stuff while phrasing it in a way that sounds positive. Again, they're just there to tell you that the game exists and give it a high score, but the author subverted that in a kind of interesting way. So, the review goes on to say, the 3D terrain twists, turns, dips, and climbs, sometimes so sharply that your car will forget that it isn't a Learjet. If you live for speed, Cruis'n will blow your doors off. And again, this review talks about some of the game's general premise without addressing the critiques head-on, although it finds a way to still shoehorn those in, which I think is fun. So here, they're noting the game's awkward level design and general difficulty in navigating the environments, which I think is a fair criticism, but they're phrasing it in a way that centers the speed of gameplay. This is a fast game, you're gonna have fun. Also, the controls are garbage, and they found a way to word that I think is just impressive. I suppose. Again, it's a product catalog. So in terms of more recent positive takes, there's a very early Waypoint article that caught my attention. Also, apparently Waypoint is sort of back, but not really. Anyway, long live Waypoint. Danica Herod wrote this fairly nostalgic article talking about playing the game with her sister when they first got an N64. Here's a quote. "We loved that fucking game. We clipped through trees and mailboxes. We drove off course and came in last so many times, but we loved that game. Lonely nights suddenly turned into trips to places we'd never been or heard of." And I do think that's one of the charms of this game, is that you're visiting real-world places. There is a sort of mythic quality to the American road trip that most people won't get the chance to actually do in real life, but this game attempts to simulate that, which I think is quite cool. In terms of another positive review, the YouTube channel Under 10 Hours gives a defense of this game, similarly looking at the negative reception on release. And namely how the game was often compared to other better racing games of the time, which were always more graphically sophisticated. And of course, Cruis'n looks quite bad in comparison. And so this video isn't trying to redeem Cruis'n USA as one of the all-time great N64 games, but rather to course correct and try to move the needle a little bit from that sort of bad N64 games, you know, Superman and Blues Brothers, trying to push things in the other direction a little bit. So anyway, those are some of the modern attempts to reappraise this game, if only slightly. And so returning to the game itself, I'm going to say a few positive things about the levels in this game. While they are mostly flat and uninteresting, there are some highlights. So first, Beverly Hills. It's a place I know about but haven't been to. I think we've all seen it in films and television, so I'm unlikely to drive through here anytime soon, but I am interested, and I thought this was a pretty nice looking level. We have the Redwood National Park, which is of course famous for Star Wars. This is the Battle of Endor, and it just looks great. Even if it's not rendered well, it still looks great. There's a lot of narrow roads in this level, similar to the real world place, which adds to the difficulty. And it's visually distinct from everything else. This isn't just a cityscape, this is the Redwood Forest. You can drive through a tree at one point, which is apparently a big tourist trap in the US. Chicago, we have these support pillars underneath the highway where you're driving through, and that made for some fun obstacles, so I thought the Chicago level was quite good. And now it's time to talk about the visuals. Cruis'n USA, not a hot looking game. It has polygonal cars and terrain, but mostly 2D environments with sprites for most of the stuff. And it's not charming, I don't think. So I'm a big fan of 2.5D, you know, putting flat objects in a 3D environment. I think that can be a pretty interesting look. However, in this case, the sprites are often taken from real-world photographs, which just has this eerie quality and, dare I say, lack of art direction. You know, I think we're all familiar with the idea that games that aim for realism are perhaps not likely to age well, and that's definitely the case here. But the Cruis'n series would eventually embrace cartoony aesthetics and absurd environments, which is absolutely the right call. Cruis'n Exotica even has a Mars level. But in terms of Cruis'n USA, and the N64 port in particular, it's a fairly grounded world built from actual photos of American cities. And some textures are more effective than others. For example, the skyboxes just don't sit right. They sort of wobble around like a PS1 or Saturn game, so the distant clouds just don't feel correct. Chicago has these 2D smokestacks and this moving airplane graphic, all of which are flat, and when that airplane flies by, it does not look good. It just looks like a flash animation, but like a beginner's flash animation. Look, I'm not saying we need ray tracing and particle simulations, but the smokestacks are quite bad looking. And the spectators. So famously, the people watching the race are standing right at the finish line in the way of the racers, which is odd. It's possible that was intended as a joke, but it just looks awkward. I'm not a fan of how this looks. Next up is the music. So Cruis'n USA is known for its kind of bizarre soundtrack, and that's maybe phrasing it generously. So there's weird samples and vocal chops of someone just going ooh and ah. Let's play a clip, it's bizarre. So yeah, it's a, pretty classy soundtrack, as you can tell. So back in that Computer and Video Games magazine review, they had that comment that it sounds like a Casio keyboard, and that's basically true. This does not sound good. Apparently there were more real instruments in the arcade version, but that of course was changed for the N64 port with its limited cartridge space. I would argue, however, that the music, while not good per se, is certainly interesting unto itself. Dare I say, entertaining. So it's bad as an in-game soundtrack, but as a discrete artifact that you can look up on YouTube and just listen to all the songs, I think this is well worth hearing. I would even put this in a canon with the Sonic R soundtrack, in that it's bad as in-game music, it's distracting and awkward and weird, but that it makes for an interesting artifact on its own. So much like I would say everyone needs to hear the Sonic R soundtrack cover to cover at some point in their life, Cruis'n USA is also essential listening on its own. It is just so distracting and goofy in ways that make for enjoyable listening, but not as background music. There's nothing background about how bizarre this all sounds. The last point I want to make about Cruis'n USA is that it has interesting systems that are just half-baked. They are not quite fully realized. So you have, of course, collision and crashes, which we would later see in the Burnout series to incredible effect. But here, there's obviously no physics simulation because that just wasn't possible, so hitting a car just triggers an animation, and this is the one you'll see 90% of the time. And again, I'm not saying I expect a full-on physics simulation in-game, but it would be nice if there was a wider variety of crash animations. There's just something about this that feels interesting and ambitious, but not quite executed well. There's also the fact that in single-player mode, you can only advance to the next race if you get exactly first place. And this, of course, makes some amount of sense in arcades. It's a way for the game to make money, frankly. But as a home console game, I don't think we see that very often. It's a weird choice for a console game, and it's especially annoying because the AI for the other racers constantly cheats. It moves in ways that are not physically possible for a player to input into the controller. It's just warping around in kind of strange ways. So the AI cheats quite a bit, and you have to be in first place to get to the next race. I think those things don't go together very well. It's not my favorite move. And so, my closing thoughts. Cruis'n USA will likely always be remembered for its bad graphics, and that seems to be a recurring theme across the reviews on release and modern discussions. And as with any new console, the N64 was marketed as a better, faster machine with more polygons than ever before, and this game just looks so decidedly early 90s. It is a questionable choice for a pseudo-launch title on a cool new console, and that's probably why the game is remembered the way it is. Occasionally on this channel, we'll revisit the aforementioned canon of bad N64 games and find something worth talking about. So as we've kind of discussed in previous videos, Quest 64 has the artifacts of a more ambitious game, Blues Brothers 2000 has its incredibly charming graphics and occasional moments of fun platforming. But Cruis'n USA just isn't all that interesting to talk about. It's not necessarily a terrible game, but it doesn't have any noteworthy features that warrant a course correction in the popular discourse. It's just a not very good game. And honestly, after thinking about this game for so long, I am still a little bit surprised that Nintendo was willing to put their name on Cruis'n USA as the publisher. Because again, it just lacks the overall polish that we expect from their games. I should put a bit of an asterisk on that. It's probably not the case today, but there was a time in human history when Nintendo games would at least run well and look far above average, and that's just not the case here. So personally, I would not recommend this game on merit, although the soundtrack is well worth listening to, if only for the sheer amusement of hearing bad sampling and weird creative choices. But as a game, this one is a fairly generic street racer, and there's no shortage of better options. So if you're into retro games and street racing, then I simply must give a shout out to Midtown Madness. This is a PC game that has the most delicious of late 90s polygonal graphics, with an open world environment that pushes the old compact Presario to its absolute limits. So if you're looking for a similar game, check out Midtown Madness, highly recommended. Thank you for watching Computer Lab Hijinks. I am Nathan, telling you to keep your files safe, keep your passwords managed, and for goodness sake, don't click on any strange links, and we'll see you in a few weeks.